whenever this topic is discussed, it's discussed in two ways that I want to illuminate. I will touch on these two ways, but I think it's the wrong approach. And I've been guilty of it also. That is, what's your view of the resurrection of Jesus? Or alternatively, what's your view, Dr. Tabor, of the empty tomb? Okay. I think the way to start is not with the resurrection, because that brings in immediately all sorts of presuppositions that even Paul dealt with. What do you mean by resurrection? What kind of a body? What was it? All the accounts. And if you start with the empty tomb, we've got Mark Goodacre pointing out to us, why are you calling it empty if it's a family burial? There could have been other people there. It's not really empty. And we know what we mean by empty, right? The place where Jesus was laid is reported as being empty, okay, in some accounts. So I think if we start with the burial and then go through our earliest sources, we can come up with something. Now, ultimately, what I'm headed for is a question that any number of you have asked, and it is the most common objection of people I take to be very sincere people, or who are saying, well, this Talpiot tomb thing, so you're saying that the body and bones of Jesus stayed in the tomb, but they still believed that he was raised from the dead. Two things. Why didn't they just go to the tomb, the enemies, and expose it and say, wait, he's not raised, he's right here? Okay, question one. I remember Jerome Murphy O'Connor wrote me years ago, a wonderful scholar, now passed. I taught with him at Notre Dame, and was with the École Biblique for years, but he was visiting at Notre Dame. I got to know him. We called him Jerry. He's a really wonderful Catholic scholar, and he wrote me and said, James, I follow all your arguments, but in the gossipy society of first century Jerusalem, don't you think the word would leak that, hey, there's this tomb over here, and everybody would go to it and say, see, he's not risen. So I want to deal with that. And the other objection is, wouldn't there be a legend or a story then about where it was in the second century, the third century, the fourth century? So let's talk about, what do we know about the burial of Jesus? Not the empty tomb, not the reports of sightings or anything like that. We're going to touch on that, but let's think about the burial. And before I go into that, here are some preliminaries in terms of just terminology. Views of resurrection of the dead in late Second Temple times are both controversial and varied and diverse, okay? And the question of when do they come forth from the dead and in what kind of a body do they come is not agreed upon in various sources. Even today, there is among rabbinic circles this view that you should not be cremated because when you're resurrected, God needs this bone that's in your neck. There's a Hebrew term for it. Whether this is thought of as metaphorically or literally, it's the same idea that the new resurrected body, even if it's enhanced and glorified and different, needs in fact to come from the old body. So you need something of the old body. In terms of dust and ashes, I'm telling you folks, there's nothing left. We are dust in the wind. Adam is told in Genesis, dust you are and to dust you will return. Abraham says in Genesis, who am I, who am but dust and ashes to speak to you, the Most High God, when he's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah and so forth. So you have this notion of corpse revival on the one hand, find that in Second Maccabees, where you're beginning to get Jews saying, well, the dead can come back, and particularly at the end of the age, okay, that they can come back. I call it corpse revival or tomb revival because someone could have been cremated or even decayed to the point. Remember, they don't embalm uh, in, in in this tradition. We're talking about Jewish ideas, and so a body will go back to nothing over a period of time, especially if it's buried in soil and there's moisture and so forth. And there will be nothing left in a wooden coffin. It will all finally be gone, depending on conditions and other things. If you're in the desert, of course, bones can survive. We know at Qumran, there are skeletal remains in some of the tombs. But you know what I mean by corpse revival. It's essentially the body gets resuscitated and comes back, not just after 5 minutes or an hour, but after days and weeks and months and years, the idea that God will bring forth the dead. Well, obviously, seen as a great miracle, kind of like the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel 37, you know, that somehow they've all got to come back together and tissue put back upon them and organs, and then they stand up and live and get breath and so forth. That would just be a reversal of Genesis 2, right? Of the dust, humans are made. They go back to the dust. So it would literally be sort of repeating that. But there's also the idea of an immortal, glorified, or in quotes, spiritual body, or heavenly body, as it can be called, and the body being the mode of existence. In other words, how will you exist in this either world or age or time, whether you think of a time period or a new creation or whatever, what kind of a body will they come, is the way Paul phrases it, else we'll see. This is in contrast with the Greek view of immortality of the soul that we know so well from Plato and the Neoplatonists, but also pretty common today. And that is that humans have a body that's perishable. All of us know that because we get old, right? And we get sick, and we've been with people when they die, and we've buried people and so forth. But it's seen as a temporary house, a prison, really. It's usually seen as negative, as kind of holding you back, and certainly in Plato. But your soul is the real you. And there are many texts on this from the Hellenistic world, and it's the dominant view of the Hellenistic world. So if you have a view either like this or like this as a Jew, uh, it's something different than the standard view of the immortality of the soul. The book I would recommend, I didn't put books here, but it's Oscar Kuhlman. I mentioned it last time. Resurrection of the Dead and Immortality of the Soul. You can get it online. Pretty sure it's a PDF because I use it in my classes. Resurrection of the Dead and Immortality of the Soul. It's a series of lectures. I think it's 5 or 6 lectures, the Ingersoll lectures in Britain. And Kuhlman is a French scholar, and the book is utterly convincing, I think, and makes it very clear that resurrection of the dead is not the same as immortality of the soul. Now, we do have a passage in Paul that helps us at least know Paul's view, and this would be in terms of our sources. I like to start with early and then move through. So one of our earliest sources would be a letter of Paul, Second Corinthians, we call it. It's a series of letters really put together. When we do the Paul course, I'll try to straighten that out for you. There are as many as 5 letters kind of put together. But he's talking about looking to the future, looking to the things that are unseen. And he says, for while we were still in this tent, now that sounds kind of platonic, like I am the real person and I'm living in a tent. So the tent's not me, right? So he's kind of accommodating to his Greek audience. We sigh with anxiety, not that we would be unclothed. Now he's switching from tent to clothing. And he also has tent and a permanent building. So it's sort of like a double metaphor. It's like living in a tent and then you get a permanent building. It's like having old clothing that you take off and you're naked. And literally, not that we would be naked, is how it can also be translated. In other words, bodiless, but reclothed. This is the RSV. I just pasted in because it's convenient. It's a good translation. We would be further clothed, but it's really reclothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now, at the moment, as Paul envisions this, at the moment of the parousia, the appearance of Jesus in the clouds of heaven, this happens to the dead first, but many of them are unclothed and their tent is long gone, right? Back to the dust. But that's not a impediment for them to come forth. So they come forth from the dead and they're already clothed in this new glorious body. And those that are living, according to Paul, in the moment, in a blink of an eye, they undergo what he calls a metamorphosis. That is, they're translated from the physical to the spiritual. So you have two states. You have the dead that are naked, but he says that's not what we want. Now, with Plato, that is what you want. Get rid of your tent, which is like a prison or a cage, and let the bird out. The bird is your soul, to fly back to God or whatever. So you can read Plato's Phaedo. You can read many sources. I have them on my website. So that's one of Paul's views. Now, in 1 Corinthians 15, he's asked specifically, and there's a lot we could discuss here, and you know it well, I'm sure. Apologists consider this the most important text on resurrection of the dead. Gary Habermas can do two 600-page volumes on it and associated things. And I have a very simple view. He says, I would remind you, remember, he's writing to the Corinthians, chapter 15. I wanted to remind you in what terms I preached to you the gospel which you received. Now, remember Galatians, the gospel which I received, I did not get it from men or from any human source, but a revelation of Jesus Christ. Most interpreters read this as he got it from James and Peter and them. That's where he got it. But I'm going to stick with the idea that he got it from the Lord in his view, by which you are saved if you hold fast unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of delivered is the opposite of receive, like you receive it and then you pass it along. I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Now, I'm not totally objecting that it could have come from James and Peter and John and the pillars of the church in Jerusalem. I'm sure he talked to them about it. Surely they compared their experiences of the risen Jesus. So, what I received that Christ, the Messiah, died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised. And there it is literally lifted up. It's the verb egero. And it would be the same verb you would use if you remember when Jesus heals the man who's paralyzed and he says, take up your bed and walk, literally to lift up. So he was lifted up. People use resurrection now as a technical term. It's anastasis in Greek. It literally means to stand up. So it's a metaphor for the dead. The dead are lying in the dust. They sleep in the dust. That's the metaphor Paul uses. Those who've fallen asleep, he calls them. And it's like, wake up, wake up, stand up. But in this case, we're talking about a corpse. He was buried. Now, all the scholars who are talking about what happened to Jesus after his death, was he left on the cross to rot? Is Joseph of Arimathea just a figment of Mark's imagination, and so forth? I just think that has no control in terms of argumentation. And I know Craig Evans and Bart have gone back and forth about it, and these are my friends. And then I also know that Dom Crossan is the first one to suggest, that burial, that's just a later tradition because we need the empty tomb. Maybe we don't need the empty tomb. Let's think about that. Let's stay with the burial. Paul has a tradition, and it is our earliest tradition that Jesus was buried. Now, he doesn't say by whom or when or how, but he says he was lifted up on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. Then he appears. Literally, this is the verb horao, has a rough breathing on it. And it is the aorist. This is actually the perfect. He was raised up. This is the aorist. We won't go into Greek tenses now. It could mean he appeared, but he appeared too sounds more like visions of Mary, over the years, like she appears to those children at Fatima and so forth. But was cited by in the dative, it would be a different translation, but it is in the passive. And it can be middle. Some of you know Greek, but I like the idea that uh, because Paul says, I have seen the Lord. So I'm taking it that way. I saw him. So I would say to you, if you were a witness, did you see him? And you say, yeah, I saw him. So I think that's the sense of it. Now, this is very helpful because Peter's first, and that actually does fit our gospel accounts, as we know. And then the 12, and then 500 brethren at once, most of whom are still alive. And notice some have fallen asleep, they're dead. I don't like translations like the new RSV that says some have died, and then it puts a note, fallen asleep. People aren't that dumb. I think they could figure this out. What, they fell asleep in church or something? Let's don't rob our language. Let's don't rob our English translation of a very powerful metaphor. And maybe it's even like, oh, well, let's don't say the dead are sleeping. Let's just say they died, and then we can talk about they're in heaven with Christ or something like that. No, they've fallen asleep. Okay. Then he appeared to James. Isn't that nice that James gets included? Wow. None of our gospels have James because they don't want to talk about James. And then all the apostles. Last of all, as one untimely born, there's his like a early birth. Some people say a miscarriage. It's not, that wouldn't be a good image, but the idea is that it wasn't 9 months to the day. Uh, uh, he was seen by me. Now you say, well, I thought it said to. It's the dative case. With the passive, it can mean by. But I'm the least and so forth. I love this, but I worked harder than them all. This is Paul at his best. People say, well, how do you know Paul isn't forged? Uh, I've read his letters 100 times in Greek. I just know how he talks, how he thinks. I think I know him. And I know his language. This is Paul. Now, if Christ is preached as lifted up from the dead, so when you're dead, you're in the dust, you sleep in the dust, and now you're lifted up from the dead. How can some of you say there's no resurrection of the dead? So see how he ties this back to this and back to this. Okay. So people today ask things like, is it a spiritual body? Is it a physical body? What is it? What was raised? What's the idea? I think it's important that we go with Paul as our earliest testimony. It is the only eyewitness testimony that we have. You've heard me say that before. You say, well, what about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Matthew was there, right? He wrote Matthew. He said that we went up to the Galilee, but he does it in the third person. He never says I. And he also says the 11, and some doubted. So I guess if you want to get technical, maybe Matthew doubted. I'm just playing with you here, but you see the idea. So let's go with our earliest account and stay with it. And so what we have is a burial and then a raising up, whatever that would entail. And then Paul's going to tell you, well, what kind of a body? Okay, so we'll come back to this because I wanted to make this first as if we're going to talk about burial. So, do I know Jesus was buried? Like, well, you could say you don't know anything, but I can say our earliest source says burial. If he wasn't buried, you don't need to say that. Christ died for our sins and was raised, right? I think the burial is important for Paul because he doesn't think the body that's planted in the dust, so to speak, is the same as the body raised. He thinks the person's the same, but he thinks the tent gets left behind. The old clothing get left behind. Think of it as rotten, worn out clothing. And now you're naked. And Plato would say, good, finally got rid of that old sick body. And now I'm free. I'm the bird out of the cage. And Paul would say, no, 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 that's not our hope. And the reason it's not our hope is Paul's greatest idea. Paul believes from clay models, from dustlings, from earthlings, from soil creatures, as I translate it, soil breathers, is potentially a metamorphosis like a caterpillar to a butterfly, but in a different way, because I mean, a butterfly is pretty amazingly different than a caterpillar. But he thinks it's actually an ontological difference. That is, your dust body is not immortal and it's weak and it's subject to aging and disease. And the new body will not be subject to those things. Now, here you would have to get into physics to talk about it in our modern day, and I'll leave that to the physicists to discuss. I'm just staying with the ancient language. But I get the idea in Paul that you don't need the continuity of somehow I need the old body, meaning I need a piece of it. Could you at least show me where it's buried, where something can come up, what we would call of the material realm? But Paul does not believe that the dead cease to exist. I know others have said when you go to Sheol, it's non-existence. Sheol is never presented as non-existence, never anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. It's the pit. It's actually their perception of the grave, right? But there's no torture there. It's not like the Gilgamesh epic, the House of the Dead. It's not like the Hadean world of the Greeks. They all have an underworld, but Sheol is, everybody goes there. And what do? They lie down, the small and the great together. Job, right? This is the idea. They lie down, they're asleep. Okay, so that's burial. Get to resurrection. Now let's go to John. What could we know about burial? Now, here I'm going to our latest source. And the reason I'm going to our latest source is because I think this section of John 19 and 20, although it's actually 18, 19, and 20, 21 is something else. If you heard my series on YouTube on the archaeology of Jesus and so forth, I talked about this, that there is within this material theology, yes, but also all kinds of very specific references to chronology, to place, like the Praetorium and where it is, and even the pavement of the Praetorium and so forth, that I think it's a source worth looking at, and it has things that Mark, our other gospel source that's the earliest, does not have. So even though theologically the entire Gospel of John is seen to be later by most, not everybody, but most scholars, uh, I don't think on this question that it should be ignored. So first of all, we have a day of preparation. In order to prevent the bodies from remaining on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that the legs might be broken. So they're trying to conform to this Torah rule. Now, Mark, if you read it a certain way, notice what I said, I can't go into that in detail now. it sounds like he's saying that the day of the crucifixion was, in fact, the high day Sabbath of the 15th of Nisan, which is called the first day of Passover. John makes it clear that no, that's the next day. And even Mark says that when Judas makes a deal with the high priest, they go, not during the feast, lest there be a riot. So, what people are going to be doing on this high day Sabbath, we had it just last week. Monday was the Passover meal, the 14th, and Tuesday was a high day. It was a Sabbath day. You say, how could Tuesday be a Sabbath day? Well, it's one of the high holy days. There's 7 of them in the Jewish festival cycle. So Judas, they say, oh, don't do it on the feast. You got to do it before the feast. And that's what John knows. What about the burial? John's account is similar to Mark's in some ways. Joseph of Arimathea comes. He also has an assistant, Nicodemus. They're both on the Sanhedrin. According to all of our sources, I don't think John says that, does he? Doesn't look like it. They go to Pilate and ask if they can take the body. Must have some kind of connection. We have later traditions that Joseph of Arimathea is either related to Joseph or Mary or both. But, this gets into all kinds of things that even have to do with Da Vinci Code stuff I don't want to get into, and it tends to be medieval and late. But they take the body and bind it in clothes and spices. And here's what I want you to notice. In the place where he was crucified was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb where no one had ever been laid. Now, everybody reads that. Bart Ehrman, Mark Goodacre, everybody. It's Joseph Arimathea's tomb, because they're reading Matthew first, Mark, and Luke. Now, Mark and Luke don't say it's Joseph Arimathea's tomb. Only Matthew says that, because he wants to fulfill the prophecy, and he made his grave with a rich man, see, with a rich man in his desk. I guess I talked to Jody once about this, and I said, do you really think Joseph happened to have a tomb in a garden near where they crucified? She goes, why not? I would say, why not? Because it's really unlikely. He's a wealthy person who probably has an estate. This is right by the walls of Jerusalem. And I think it's on the Mount of Olives. And though they're not private estates on the Mount of Olives, it's a kind of a public area. It's actually a necropolis. It's an area of tombs. And it would make sense that there's a garden and a new tomb. But here's what I want you to notice. This is the verse I never hear discussed. Now, because of the Jewish day of preparation, we've just had it explained, as the tomb was close at hand. So 2 reasons. We don't have a lot of time, and you see that tomb over there, it's not being used. We'll put him there. Okay, next verse. On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early while it was dark and saw the stone had been taken away. Now, so she was around when this is being done, according to several of our sources. The women are at the cross or around from a distance, and it even says in Mark, it says they watched where he was laid. But please don't forget that verse. So I think it's an emergency temporary burial. Okay. Then on the first day of the week, that's Sunday morning, even before the sun's up, she gets there and she wants to weep and cry and maybe wait for them to come to move the stone and be part of the the anointing and the washing. They haven't had time to prepare the body for burial. They've just taken it out of the cross. It's bloody, it's beat up, it's bruised, it's in bad shape. They wrap him up. They do put spices, but they've got a lot more that perhaps could even be used later. And on the first day, she comes and the stone's away. So she runs to Simon and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said, notice, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they've laid him. So John puts that in. Now, John, this is not John's final view. He's going to add other things and resurrection and appearances. But I believe in composing his gospel, he has earlier sources, and I think this is one of them. I think this is the earliest source we have, and the writer of the Gospel of John, or the writers of the Gospel of John, are aware of it because it fits all of the facts and it fits Paul. Jesus is buried, but it's a hasty burial. And the reaction is absolutely what you would expect. Almost like saying, I got here so early, but they've already moved him. Now, what time did they move him? I don't know. Maybe they came an hour before. Maybe they came the night before. You know, once Saturday is over, we're talking about Thursday crucifixion, all day Friday, all day Saturday. You can't, those are double Sabbaths. You can't take care of a body. You would think they would go Saturday night, you know, and begin, but Saturday night, it's pitch dark. Do you really want to do it at night? And they're going to rebury him. We don't know where they've laid him. Uh, Peter runs, James, the beloved disciple, runs to the tomb, and they're just mainly verifying, like, wow, you're right. It's empty. And then it says, then the disciples went back to their homes, literally to their own places. Now, did that pericope originally? I'm talking about John 20, 1 through 9, or 10 rather. Was that originally the whole story? And then the appearances in the Galilee. This could fit. Back to their homes could be the Galilee. Now you say, well, it could be Bethany where they're staying. It could be. I'm not saying it isn't. If you keep reading, then it would be. Okay, Mark's account, which is our earliest in terms of a literary document, but I think this is earlier. He's got something pretty similar. He's still got the women and they want to anoint him, and he's got Joseph burying him. And he also does not say that this is Joseph's tomb. He granted the body, he bought a linen shroud, laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock. Uh, and also the idea that this is a new tomb and that it hasn't been used by anybody. You know, the Mount of Olives is an acropolis. Tombs are there, they're in various stages of being finished, and you can't take the body home. They're already ritually pure. If they're going to follow a ritual purity, they have to go immediately to the mikveh and get ready for the Seder that night. They're going to eat the Passover that night. Same with the high priest. They're not out burying bodies, having trials, planning crucifixions during their Passover meal. That's over. Okay. So what does Mark say? Just that they come and they find him. They find the tomb empty, and they're told, "You'll see him in Galilee." And they flee from the tomb and say nothing to anyone, and that's how Mark ends. Now, my own sense is that Mark has his theology here, and he is of the view that that glorified transfiguration in the Galilee on a mountain that Jesus told them to go to, you'll see him in the Galilee as he told you, is the site that they're remembering, so that the transfiguration is almost let's call it a proleptic resurrection experience. If you want to know what resurrection of the dead is, it's suddenly seeing Moses and Elijah and Christ in full glory on a mountain. Is it a vision? Is it real? Well, Mark certainly thinks they're going to go to Galilee and see him. But in terms of, let's see, he is crucified, he has risen. That's the same word. He's been lifted up. Come see the place where they laid him. I don't know if Mark is getting his empty tomb from this. I don't know. I'm not sure of that. I don't know that he had this. This is a tradition John has that I think is earlier. I don't know if he's getting it from this. So even though I can talk about an empty tomb, there are two kinds of empty tombs, possibly. One is Mark's empty tomb, where essentially the body just kind of melts and disappears, and Jesus is lifted up to heaven and you will see him in his glory or something like that. But John, literally, his empty tomb is like, it's not the tomb where we're going to leave him. We don't own this tomb. It's not our tomb. We're putting him there for the feast. So basically, this is all I know right here. This is what I think I would stay with as a historian, that Joseph of Arimathea, probably Nicodemus, took charge of an initial emergency burial and then took him and reburied him. So how can you believe in resurrection? Then we have the Gospel of Peter, which is so odd because it seems to be built on Mark, and yet at the end, right here, it's really, really odd. So let's read it if you've never read it. We have it in different versions, but the main version was only discovered in the 19th century. But we have references. Now, at the dawn of the Lord's Day, already call it the Lord's Day. So, you see the Christian influence. So I think it is second or third century, but certainly second. So the Jews are flamed with anger. And so they did not at the tomb carry out the rites of burial. So she gets her woman friends and they come to the tomb. Notice where he had been placed. Now that is interesting, isn't it? Where he'd been placed. Kind of like, let's put him here. And they were afraid lest the Jews should see them and were saying, if indeed on that day on which he was crucified, we couldn't weep and beat ourselves, yet now at his tomb we may do these things. But who's going to roll away for us the stone at the door in order, having entered, we may sit beside him and do these things? They want to get in the tomb, go in the tomb, and be secluded in this account and not be seen, and wash the body and clean it of the blood and the, it's beginning to decay a bit, right? But the stone is large and they're also afraid somebody's going to see them. And if we're unable, let us throw against the door what we bring memory of him, meaning we'll just lean against the stone and cry and beat ourselves. And having gone off, they found the sepulcher opened. Wow, it's already open. And they come forward and they bent down, and there was a young man. Notice, still not an angel coming from heaven, not an earthquake, nothing. There's a young man. He does have a nice robe on, splendid robe. And he says, why have you come? Whom do you seek? Not that one crucified. He is risen and gone away. Now, what, did he walk down the road or what? Let's keep reading. But if you do not believe, bend down and see the place where he lay, because he's not here. He's risen and gone away to there thence he was sent, or gone away to the place from which he was sent, which probably refers to the idea of heaven. He went back to where he came. Then the woman fled frightened. So they just take it as he's been taken up to heaven. Now, I don't claim that this fits this, John. It seems to be built more on Mark, but it makes it clear that the body's gone and he's taken up. But notice this. This is what I want you to notice, 58 and 59. Now we jump a week. We jump a week ahead. This is written by Peter, supposedly. You're going to see the I, or the first person. Now it was the final day of unleavened bread. That's the 21st of Nisan. This week, remember I said Monday night was Passover. Tuesday is the holy day, right? The days of the week are different, right? So the 21st of Nisan will be this coming Monday, just 2 days from now. So it's been 8 days since the crucifixion, and many went out returning to their homes since the feast is over. We found that out at Waco. People didn't realize the Passover lasts 8 days. There's the Passover, killing of the lambs, the Seder in the evening, and then 7 days of unleavened bread. Very important. In fact, it's called more often the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the book of Deuteronomy and so forth. But we 12 disciples of the Lord were weeping and sorrowful, and each one sorrowful because of what had come to pass, departed to his home. But we went, departed to his home. And I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew, having taken our nets, went off to the sea, and there with us was Levi of Alphaeus, whom the Lord, and then it unfortunately breaks off. But I think we can be pretty sure what it said. It's probably like John 21. They went up to the Galilee and the Sea of Galilee, and there they saw him. Now you say, so you have a gospel that has them weeping and sorrowful, not believing for a whole week, mourning because they found an empty tomb, but they haven't seen Jesus. So what these sources tell us is that one of the views of resurrection, and I think this fits Paul's view, is that Jesus was buried, but then glorified and lifted up, just like the dead in Christ are going to be raised when Jesus returns. They'll be raised immortal and incorruptible. So that the flesh and blood body is of no consequence. Now, here's where I can never be understood, and maybe you guys can understand me. My view of the empty tomb, or them visiting a tomb and the body's gone, here is simply a reburial. It's just a reburial. It's exactly what you would expect. Temporary emergency burial, you got to put him somewhere later. It's not resurrection faith. This is not resurrection faith. Now, all the other accounts are cutting to the chase. I say all the other, they're doing more than that. But as a minimum, they're saying because that tomb was empty and he's gone, they can't find the body, then he's been raised. Well, now we need appearances, right? Like, where is it? Oh, it's on a road walking with two men. It's suddenly appears in a room with the disciples. And he says, look, I'm not a spirit. I'm not a ghost. Here, touch me. Look at these wounds. Look, give me some food. I'm hungry. That's Luke. That's John, right? Mark doesn't have that. So if I'm trying to put together what happened, here's what I'm trying to do. Now, this is Tabor. I'm not claiming Mark 16 fits John 20. You follow? And I'm not claiming 1 Corinthians 15 fits John 20, although I do happen to think it does the best. But here's what I think. I think what happened is the view of resurrection leaves the tent behind. It's of no consequence. And there's no faith at this point. They're weeping, they're sorrowful. But when they go up to the Galilee is the recovery of faith. Either on the Sea of Galilee or at the mountain north where the transfiguration was. I don't know where it was, but it was in the Galilee. And in Luke, he's so against that because you've got James and everybody going back home. Mary, everybody's up north and they're going to see Jesus. And Luke is against that. So what does he have? He says that Jesus says, do not leave the city. On the day he appears to them, I don't want you leaving the city. So they have to stay all the way to Shavuot, Pentecost, which is 49 days later. By that time, it's 47 days later. That's Luke. And he's got appearances, right? And it's like and then he gets taken to heaven. Eventually, he still gets taken to heaven and presumably gets metamorphosized into a heavenly body. And then I'm going to stop the share and I want to just talk to you about how I would put this together and why there's no problem with a Talpiot tomb with Jesus' body in it, if that happens to be the tomb, and it doesn't have to be. There's two things I've never said that I'm accused of saying by everyone. Jesus' father was a Roman soldier named Pantera, and the Talpiot tomb is the Jesus family tomb. I've never said either one of those things. What I've said is, let's look at all the evidence about Pantera, and let's look at all the evidence about the Talpiot tomb, or tombs, because there are two. So back to the idea, the question, and this all comes from the question that several of you have raised and many people have raised. How could Jesus have been finally put, and this is my view, that he was reburied, his body was reburied in a permanent tomb, temporarily first, And I'm not connecting those empty tomb stories to Mark, but only to John. They could be connected to Mark too. See, Mark is much later after 70, I think. And who knows, maybe there is a story. I heard that the women went and the tomb was already empty. But you see, it can become a different story. Now it can become, oh, it was empty because he was taken up and there was nothing there. You see the idea? How I do think there was an empty tomb, but I don't think it the way, say, Gary Habermas would. Oh, Tabor says there was an empty tomb. Okay, we got it now. So when they went, the body went, absolutely. Because if you rebury a body, it's not there. But I don't think it has a thing to do with resurrection of the dead. Why? Because of Paul's view of resurrection. And he's our earliest witness. And he says, I delivered to you. And then he likens it to Peter and Paul, Peter and James and the others. He said, this is what we all believe. And what do they all believe? That a dustling, an earthling, corruptible, mortal, perishable has been buried and like a seed dissolved. That's one of his analogies. And then from the dead, from the realm of the dead, of being dead, has come a life-giving spirit. No longer flesh and blood. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom, and so forth. So why do we have these other accounts in Luke and in John and one in Matthew? Even though Matthew says, yeah, it was in the Galilee, but we weren't sure what we saw. I actually like that one. You know, I mean, I can't even believe he wrote that. But some doubted. Well, he probably appeared to them later and ate a meal with them, and then they didn't doubt. I don't know. But I mean, that's the way Matthew ends. It's my understanding is it's what the Greeks call apotheosis. Apotheosis is leaving the shell behind, leaving the old clothes behind, and your essential self, which is now naked, well, usually today call it the soul. That's the Greek term. It's not the term in Paul, because the Sukikon body is actually this body. I have a soul body right now. I don't have a wind body. I wish I did. Then I wouldn't be aging, right? And I could have all this power and do all kinds of enhanced things. I just have a regular body. But let's just, soul is good. I'm okay with soul because soul can mean the essence of the person, you know, the inner will, even nephesh, which means to breathe. Uh, these are all metaphors. I mean, even pneuma is wind, right? They're metaphors, unseen. So my understanding is that Jesus died, he was buried, emergency, then he was moved and reburied, very possibly at Talpiot or a tomb like that. And the women came to the tomb and knew where the tomb was, and the early followers knew where the tomb was. And I think the enemies knew where the tomb was, but they're not going to violate, you don't violate a tomb. Now, later, when Matthew's account is circulating and Mark's, not so much Mark, but Matthew's, because Mark didn't have appearances, physical appearances in Mark 16. But when Luke and John and into the second century, but late first century, you're going to have people saying, well, the empty tomb is proof that it's a real resurrection. Otherwise, it could just be a ghost. So they're giving up on Paul's view of a spiritual body. See? Otherwise, it could just be a ghost. So it needs to be a corpse for a while that's breathing and living, the real flesh and bone. So I'm not a ghost. I'm here, touch me. Look at my wounds. Same with John. And that was an apologetic view that developed because Paul's view, a dust being raised and transformed and reclothed in heavenly life, is just not going to be enough to prove it. Because then people like Kelsis are going to say, oh, yeah, right. So you saw something. Oh, that's real convincing. I'm going to change my whole life over your hallucinations. See, you see the idea? So you got to have proof. So now we got 40 days of proof. He eats with them. talks with them. There's no doubt. And then he ascends to heaven. Presumably, then he would get transformed. Because Luke does believe in the transformation of the body, remember? But he kind of slips up. If Luke wrote Acts, if the author of Luke wrote Acts, and I think he did, in Luke, when Jesus is asked about resurrection, he said they're not male or female, they don't marry, they're like angels, they're eternal. He's given the Paul view of the body. So it could be that, like, yeah, but we need him in the earthly body for a while, then he can go to that body, that that enhanced angelic body. But we need him here a while because otherwise people aren't going to believe. If I just say, I was up in Galilee and I saw this light and I heard a voice and I felt this presence and I know it was him. And he's sitting at the right hand of God. Now, did you notice on my notes I had two other possibilities? Now we're talking about the body. For Paul, the body's dust. Who cares about the body? Bodies go back to dust. For Daniel 12, those who sleep in the dust will awake and shine like the stars forever. That's the earliest view in the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, of resurrection. There's a little passage in Isaiah 26, but I'd like to see you translate it. It's like, thy dead will live, my dead body will arise, Yahweh talking. Not quite sure what to do with that. And then if you look at the English, they try to fix it up. But it could just be saying, look, when the nations die, they're just dead, but we still have hope in God. Even though Jews in the Hebrew Bible did not fully affirm, the full resurrection and afterlife, they say things like, even if I make my bed in Sheol, you are with me, right? So it gets into geography where people say, yeah, but Dr. Tabor, where do you think the dead are? Are we talking about latitude and longitude? No, no. What are we talking about? Outer space? What? This is a locative universe. What do you mean where they are? Let's talk about in what state are they? They're in a disembodied, inactive state likened to sleep. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. They rest from their labors and their works do follow them, is the essential view. Now, Paul does say that the dead depart to be with Christ, at least in his case. If you have my book, Paul's Ascent to Paradise, I discuss the different possibilities. One is he thinks he will achieve some apotheosis before the parousia, that he's been told, you know how you were in the third heaven and you saw all the glory of Christ sitting at the right hand of God? When you die, you're going to get that proleptically ahead of the rest. Even that's a possibility. I know that's crazy, but I think he said, it's better for me to die and be with Christ. But most Christian believers would say, no, to be in Christ means, think of it as he's got the whole world in his hands. You're in the hand of Christ, the presence of Christ. You're not lost. You're remembered. You're there. But what are you doing? Having talks, doing stuff, carrying out deeds? No, you're sleeping. But when you come forth from the dead, you will come in a new state that will be, actually, Paul says, beyond angels. And it's a new genus in the universe. It's called, in Greek, the children of God or sons of God. And in Romans 8, he says it's a new thing in the universe that has never existed. One of them exists so far. Let us make man dust of the earth. And then the second Adam becomes a life-giving spirit. And you know those texts in 1 Corinthians 15 and so forth. My understanding of Paul's view, but there's a Suke body, which is the body you have now, and he makes it clear it's of the dust, it's flesh and blood. It's the body of dust. The first man, Adam, was of the dust. The last Adam of the new creation, meaning the first of the new creation, the firstborn of many to come, is of the Spirit. In fact, not just of the Spirit, but it's translated a life-giving spirit, has the word poieo in it, a life-giving spirit. So when we talk about a spiritual body, it means a spirit being, the word being, a spirit entity. Body means your mode of existence. Before the resurrection, or let's just don't even call it the resurrection, before the metamorphosis comes at the parousia, the dead are naked and not further clothed. At the parousia, they're further clothed. Now, when the parousia didn't come, everybody wanted to rush it and say, well, couldn't they get glorified right now with God in heaven? And that became the view of everybody because it's more comforting, right? But if you have the view of a day as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a day, and the dead are basically sleeping metaphorically in the keeping of God, then their next conscious second would be the transformation. So it's really not a long wait. And you have your life and you go to sleep, and the next moment you would be awake. Who's had surgery and gone under? We all know the feeling. You go 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and then did you do it yet? It's called being unconscious, right? Your consciousness anesthesia is a kind of scary, amazing thing. But you're still here. So it's just an analogy. So what happened to the body? My sense would be that the movement is expecting the kingdom of God in Jerusalem. They have no problem with a faithful disciple, Joseph Arimathea, maybe a relative of the family. And if so, maybe also a Davidic person of Davidic lineage taking care of the burial on his estate. Nobody's interested in the corpse. Now, you could, before 70, you could visit the tomb, you could remember it. Many of you visited tombs of your family, but I bet most of you don't think the person is there in the tomb, in a symbolic way, maybe, but they're gone. And depending on how they were buried or cremated or whatever. But it is nice. Tombs are nice in the sense that they are the memories of the family together. And ossuaries do offer a kind of individuality that people seem to like more and more in the Herodian period. Like put this person with his wife, and they had a little baby that died, put the baby in with them, and so forth. So that's where I would go first if I'm just speculating. But I think it's also possible that they could take the body back and bury it in the Galilee. I think it's unlikely because I think they're all going to be down in Jerusalem for Pentecost, and they expect them to stay in Jerusalem because they believe the kingdom of God is coming, right? And very soon they probably believe, and everything's being run from Jerusalem. So they've left the Galilee. The movement has headquartered now in Jerusalem with James the Just living in Jerusalem, and it's called the Jerusalem Church.